It can clearly be said that tyranny suppresses and eliminates freedom, but on the other hand, tyranny is only possible where freedom has been domesticated and has evaporated into vacuous concepts.
Welcome back to another MindMatters show. Today we want to talk about Ernst Jünger and his book Forest Passage, which is kind of a classic and has kind of caught some attention again and gained some traction, I suppose, these days, and we will probably see why. To give like a very short background on Ernst Jünger, he's like a fascinating guy with a fascinating life. He was born in the late 19th century in 1895, I think. Fought in World War I, was a highly decorated soldier. Then he published, after the war, he published his book, Storms of Steel, I think is the English title. It's his war memoir, basically, which made him famous. And he continued to publish lots of essays, books, until his death in 1996, I think he was, or
98.
98 even, yeah. Mm-hmm. So he was, I think, 102 years old when he died. Just a very brief sketch. In the 20s, he was kind of like mingling with the nationalist circles, this whole intellectual scene there, which he was also later criticized for by leftists, basically, or by left intellectuals post-war. But he was not really associated with the Nazis or the proto-Nazis even at the time. So there were like different, let's say, like movements critical of democracy, different kind of nationalist flavors and discourse, and that was all basically like a big intellectual scene in Berlin. And the communists too, were kind of like in that sphere at the time, and they were like all kind of anti-democratic. So they all basically hated the Weimar Republic, or many did, and because it was pretty bad at the time, right? I mean, it's not really a surprise that people, had all kinds of ideas and stuff. In any event, the Nazis tried to kind of like get him on their side when they took power, because he was a war hero, and he wrote that famous book about his experience in World War I. So they kind of tried to seduce him, let's say, but he refused. He was never like really associated with the Nazis, and later got stationed in Paris as a soldier again during World War II. Where he mingled with all the intellectual elite in Paris at the time, and continued writing, and eventually got involved with the Stauffenberg plot, so the plot to kill Hitler, basically. And but he was only very tangentially involved, and there are like all kinds of stories. I encourage everybody to check out his Wikipedia entry. It's just, even like this Wikipedia entry reads like a crazy novel or something. I mean, this guy's life is just astonishing, really. And and so after the war, he was forbidden to publish by the British authorities because he refused the denazification program. So he basically refused to cooperate with these kinds of questionnaires, that sought to establish purity and non-affiliation with the Nazis. And he was always kind of a contrarian. We'll get to that too in his book. It's kind of interesting that he refused that, so he couldn't publish for as long as the occupation was going on. And then I think in 1951, Forest Passage was published, the book that we'll talk about today. So right after the German Federal Republic was founded, then he could publish again, and so that so just to give an idea of the time. And I find it also very interesting because in this book we will see that he kind of like describes like a life or a possible life of resistance, and what a special form of resistance, let's say. And you could say that, you know, he had maybe the communist and Nazi regimes in mind. So at some points in the book, that's pretty obvious. But then again, he didn't write it specifically, like, you know, with a for a specific type of government, let's say. And it's interesting that he wrote that right after like the German Federal Republic was established, right? The great democracy and stuff. And but I thought, you know, when you read that book, it becomes clear that he saw some of those totalitarian impulses there too, right? So it's pretty ubiquitous, that kind of dynamic that he's describing. Which also fits with his, like, you cannot really pin him down. If you look at his writing, at his life, yes, he was like kind of a conservative. He was at some points had like nationalist ideas in his life. So he certainly wasn't a leftist, but you cannot really pin him down ideologically very hard. I mean, later he was like kind of like experimenting with LSD and stuff, and he was hated by the conservatives for that. You know, he was never really religious, although he clearly had a very like non-materialist and very metaphysical view, let's say, of the world. So it's just a fascinating character, and and as a German, can say he's had a big influence. He was very well regarded for a long time, but he also was hated by many people. So there's a kind of complexity there. And so I might just open the floor. I would be interested, guys. What did you get out of that German classic?
Well, do you want to go, Ilan?
No, go ahead.
Well, we still haven't finished it. You read the book and recommended it to us, so we are still making our way through it. I'm about a third of the way through. It's pretty short. It's only around 100 pages in English, and it took me a few pages to get into his style, because it's I don't know how to describe it, but basically it took me a while to understand what he was actually talking about. And then, because I purposefully didn't read the introduction. I just went straight into it. I'll read the introduction afterwards. So I kind of just plunged in, and I'm like, what is he talking about? And so and part of that might be the German, part of it might be the translation, where there's some sentences where I'm just like, I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. But it all kind of, despite that, it all kind of comes together and ends up making sense. And it's a very interesting book. I'd say it's unlike, it's unlike probably anything else that I'd read before, but some of the subject matter is the same. It's an interesting meditation on tyranny and freedom, maybe to help guide the conversation, not the translation. I'll read how the book ends, which is a summary. The book itself is divided into 34 kind of small sections or chapters. They might be like a page long or 4 or 5 pages long. And then at the end of the book, I noticed this by skipping ahead, he ends it with a summary where he kind of summarizes each section in a sentence or half a sentence, and basically writes a long paragraph summing up the whole book, or the whole essay, or what's another word? Manuscript, monograph, maybe monograph, I'm not sure. But this is how he summarizes it. This will give some idea of the overall the overall points that he's trying to make, and then we can get into some details because each of these small sentences contains a whole lot of cool stuff. So he writes, "The questions put to us are simplified and made more incisive. They drive us into an either-or decision, as revealed in elections. The freedom to say no is systematically excluded. This is intended to demonstrate the superiority of the questioner, and it turns a nay into a venture that only 1 in 100 will dare. The arena for this venture is strategically ill-chosen. This is no objection to its ethical significance. The forest passage is freedom's new answer. Free men are powerful, even in tiny minorities. Our present epoch is poor in great men, but it brings figures to the light. The danger leads to the formation of small elites. The figures of the worker and the unknown soldier are joined by a third, the forest rebel. Fear can be conquered by the individual once he realizes his power. The forest passage, as free action in the face of catastrophe, is independent of the foreground political technicalities and their groupings. It does not contradict the development, but brings freedom to it through the decisions of the individual. In the forest passage, there is a meeting of man with himself in his undivided and indestructible substance. This meeting banishes the fear of death. Even the churches can only lend a hand here, since man stands alone in his choices. The theologian may be able to make his situation clear to him, but cannot deliver him from it. The forest rebel crosses the null meridian under his own power. In the questions of healthcare, law, and arms, he takes his own sovereign decisions. Morally, too, he does not act according to any doctrine, and reserves the right to judge the law for himself. He takes no part in the cult of crime. He decides what to consider property and how he will defend it. He is aware of the inviolable depths from which the word rises up constantly fulfill the world. Herein lies the task of being here and now." So he starts with this discussion of elections and like the questionnaire and how elections used to be, if I'm remembering correctly, he characterizes elections in their like free states as an expression of the will, and that's how people commonly think of them. They want to make a decision and they vote, and they choose someone to act on their behalf or something like that. And whatever the problems might be, even with that conception, in a tyranny, and it seems to me that here he's pretty much explicitly almost referring to like Stalinism, or maybe even Germany under fascism. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And he describes the elections, and of course, we all know the quotation ascribed to Stalin that it's not who. How is it? It's who counts the votes that matter. It's not something. It's who counts the votes that matter. Mm-hmm. But Jünger makes the point that, so in an election, let's say, where you get a 98% yes for, let's say, Stalin or some dictator or whatever, he's saying one of the side points that he makes is that it's not that it's not that they have to fudge the results. It's like you can pretty much believe that that vote was probably pretty close. You can even for the sake of argument, he's saying we can accept that 98% of the people would vote yes, because this isn't an election. He calls it a questionnaire. That's one of the things that first confused me. I'm like, well, what does he mean by a questionnaire? Like I just didn't understand what he meant by that.
Yeah. It's probably the translation thing, okay. But it's like putting someone to the question,
right?
Kind of sense,
right? And that's what came out. That's what came out after in like 5 or 10 pages. I'm like, okay, that's more like it. It's like it's being put to the question. So there's and he kind of draws that out as he's writing. You get the kind of connotations that he's putting into it, that it's not just a question. It's a question that's put to you, and there are expectations for how you'll answer.
An interrogation.
It's an interrogation, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, just say that he actually, when he develops that argument, right, when leading up to his discussion of elections and all that, he says basically that that the powers that be, they give you this question just independently even of like elections or something, just the question, and and they're not interested in truth. They're not interested in your solution. They're just they're interested in your answer, basically affirming the thing, right? And that's pretty much like, even apart from the election thing, right? What we can see everywhere with ideologies and stuff. When somebody just expects an answer, basically, that's the point, I think.
Mm-hmm. And tied into something you just said there, it's the way the question is phrased. This is how he puts it. He basically calls them like plebiscites or referenda. And they're phrased in terms, he says, now on top of that, the statement required of him is clothed in highly respectable formulations. He's called on to participate in a vote for freedom, or perhaps a peace referendum. But who does not love peace and freedom? Only a monster. A nay vote already receives a criminal character here, and the bad voter resembles a criminal slinking up to the scene of a crime. So he says, basically saying, when there's this election, where the powers that be receive 98% vote of confidence, it's pretty much, well, who will argue against a vote for liberation or peace or stability? And so he's basically saying the majority in this case, the majority vote, yes, is meaningless. It doesn't even matter if there's a majority that agrees that there's something different going on here. This isn't an election. This isn't an expression of people's will, either individually or collectively. This is being put to the question, and there are all kinds of other forces and things going on to make this situation what it is. And one of the important points and how this relates to the Forest Passage is he's talking about this 2%, the 2% that vote nay, the 2% that say no. And in that little summary, it came out. He basically says this isn't the best course of action. In fact, it's strategically or tactically ill-informed, but still it's still a good sign of something. But if the people voting nay understood what was really going on, maybe they wouldn't even vote nay, because he points out that in this type of system, in this totalitarian system, the ruling powers would not want 100% of the vote. In fact, he said if they were to receive 100%, they would then fudge the numbers to receive 99 or 98%, because they need that little sign that things aren't quite perfect. Because if everything was perfect, then there would be no need for police. There would be no need for, it would imply that everything was perfect. And then the contradiction that is apparent in the way the society is structured would just be, would blow everything up, because everything is obviously not perfect if you need so many secret police officers, for instance.
It also preserves the illusion of a democracy. Mm-hmm. It creates the perception that, see, people disagree with us and we allow it because this is a democracy. And
it's only 2%. It's like, but at the same time, those 2% can be dangerous, so we have to watch out for them. And those are the evil people that are always there, and we've always got to be vigilant, because that 2%, going to have to capture and torture them and throw them in concentration camps.
It's interesting. I mean, that same dynamic. I was just thinking, when you said that, like in the US, like it used to be like, the Klansmen, or the neo-Nazis, who like are like a ridiculously small minority, right? And nobody really cares, but they were always held up, like as the evil, and that's why we need all that, all that stuff and all that internal like police and spies and whatever. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that same dynamic, but now it's shifted to the point where it's all Republicans who are neo-Nazi Klansmen.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? So then, presumably, if things were to follow their course and, the United States becomes what it essentially is now, is like a one-party state, then then the votes will go up to like 98%. And then it'll just be those 2% who are the Republicans. Like, those Republicans, that 2% Republicans. It's like, I mean, we're a democracy. We got to let them say what they want, but they're always there. And then, yeah, it'll be something like that.
Well, I have to say, Luke, there were moments, I got about halfway through the book myself, and there were a number of times I was reading it and thinking, God, this guy just absolutely nails it in his deep understanding of what totalitarianism is. And it gave me the feeling like the book could have been written yesterday. It could have been, some contemporary work of analysis on exactly what we're seeing today. And I think that speaks to a few things, and that is how universal or cyclical and perennial all of these psychological structures are, and how they exist through time, through the generations, through, in Germany and Western Europe 70 years ago, and in the West and the US today. And I felt like it reminded me quite a bit of Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies, which is a book I love and we repeatedly come back to, which described how Eastern Europeans mainly dealt with the communist totalitarian political structure of what was then the USSR, and how they preserved the modicum of independence and freedom to practice religion, where there was all of this oppression. But this book, The Forest Passage, seems to be first of all, I think it's a great compliment to that book, because what it does is it gives a kind of philosophical explanation of what these people were doing, as Rod Dreher examined in that book. And it goes through all of the different ways in which a person can come to think about their own independence, a middle way, he calls it, that is not quite a reaction, but a response to the oppression, and why we want to think on oppression. We want to meet it head on, in a sense, albeit in a way that maybe isn't always obvious to the people who are doing the oppressing. So I'm really looking forward to reading the second half, because, as you said, just before we started the show, it gets even better. And there were a couple of other things about it. He talks about, in much the same way that I think Peterson does, the importance of mythology and story and symbolism and poets as the strength or the material from which we can draw the lessons of dealing with the ogre, the totalitarian monster, and that all of this material it's readily available should we choose to access it, and find this way to a part of ourselves that also draws upon God and higher levels of being that can protect us, that can make us strong in the face of all kinds of things that we're seeing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where the second half goes, because he gets into the minutia of all of these kinds of attitudes and ways that we perceive things that can be changed and altered for the better.
One of the things that, this relates to one of the things you said in there, Ilan, that opens up the question for me, the next 2/3 of the book, but I assume the second half as well, in section 13, he writes, this is the section on fear. He writes, might it be possible to lessen the fear even as the automatism progresses, or, as can be foreseen, approaches perfection? Would it not be possible to both remain on the ship, that is like the Titanic, heading for the iceberg, and retain one's autonomy of decision? That is, not only to preserve, but even to strengthen the roots that are still fixed in the primal ground. This is the real question of our existence. So he's basically saying that even in this state of automatism and tyranny, is it not possible to actually refine oneself in that process, to actually like not only escape the fear, but to approach like a different kind of perfection? And that will be like the forest passage. It's not the kind of ineffectual nay vote. He even says, I didn't find it, but on the subject of the nay vote, he basically says that like someone who takes the forest passage might even be able to vote yay, to vote yes, like with a clear conscience, because even as a joke, or even as a statement in itself, just to point out the absurdity of the problem, of the situation. And so when he's back to the subject of the election, he's saying that, everything's different. This is a totally new relation of power, as he says. So the old rules don't even apply anymore. It's not like it is courageous to vote nay because there are all sorts of dangers associated with it. It's just not very effective. He said, you can vote yes and still make an effective protest, even just by, he gives a progression of like graffiti. He says, even writing on a bridge, I voted no, when you voted yes, is a much bigger protest because everyone can see it, and all the people who agree can say, I know what that means. And he says, you don't even need to make it a sentence. You can just write no, and everyone will know what that means. Just writing no, everyone will be like, okay, yeah, I know what that means. And he says, or, you can even just write a letter. You can write the letter R, and everyone will know what that means because it'll mean like rebel, revolt, blah, 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 all these R words. And even that small symbolic gesture will be many times more effective than voting nay, because by voting nay, you are just giving them what they want, because they want that 2%. They want that 2%, like for all the reasons we said, to show that it's a real democracy, to justify the police presence, to justify their the whole system, to justify the fear, to be able to demonize whoever the scapegoat of the minute will be. There are other ways to be effective, and I presume that he'll get into more of that in the second half.
And that's where he, like, some of the things that he's talking about with that, like, he gave the specific example of, writing resist or the letter R on a bridge. And that has, very specific, time-oriented, like, markers to it, like, in order to have a bridge, you have to be in a society that has bridges, and that kind of a thing. But his point is timeless. And then a lot of what he writes about is timeless. And it's all geared towards, and that's why I think, Alon, what you were saying about how, this feels like it could have been written yesterday is because of that fact that he was able to touch upon the essence of what's going on. And he says as much in the book at several points where, let's not get caught up in the details of the time, whatever it is, whatever mask that tyranny wears will change over time, over epochs. What was true of tyranny in ancient Rome, that mask, has a different face now than it did then, but the tyranny remains the same. And this is another thing that's interesting about how he both wasn't religious and yet used religious themes. It ties in with this because it's, I don't remember if he uses the word demonic, but
he does.
Does he? Yeah. So he even uses religious language to describe the face of, but that to describe the thing that lies behind the mask of tyranny in our time. You know, he's pulling the mask down to show you the real face of what it is that we're up against. And it is this archetypal, you know, religious, you know, these are the only kind of frameworks in which it really exists fundamentally, is outside of the specific situation and yet is embedded within it. And so I was really just struck by his ability to see past the culture wars of his time. Much like a lot of people in our time get caught up in the cultural wars of the day and miss the subtlety and the nuance of what's really going on, which is this seeking of control through connivances, and he seeks to, I guess, teach people the way, like the middle way, a third way. In developing one's own conscience and ability to resist and withstand, and
maybe even a fourth way.
Maybe even a fourth way.
Yeah. No, there's certainly like parallels with Gurdjieff's some of Gurdjieff's ideas, and he even mentions him, I think, in a funny way in the book. He says like this really strange kind of. I don't know, like it was funny formulation, but he must have been in Paris around the same time, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe they even had, I mean, he sure knew of him, you know, so I'm not sure whether they had more contact. But it's really about, I think, inner transformation. That's what he's after, right? And forest rebel, the word in German is actually a forest walker. So it sounds a little less, like a band of armed rebels in the forest. So it's
less
more like
Robin Hood.
Yeah, it's more like a metaphor, right? And he also says that freedom, it kind of, at some point, it always, words like freedom or like democracy, things like that, they always become like stale at some point, and just a shield, like a slogan. And but that's only because people have forgotten about their meaning, and he kind of saw that these phases of tyranny and are actually a great teacher, so that people, or at least the minority who's able to do it, can get in touch, with their inner freedoms, and can be transformed, so to say, and become a force of renewal. And to this,
well, yeah. Hold that point. I just want to read a really quick quotation on that point. He says, "Fundamentally, freedom and tyranny cannot be considered in isolation, although we observe them succeeding each other in time. It can clearly be said that tyranny suppresses and eliminates freedom, but on the other hand, tyranny is only possible where freedom has been domesticated and has evaporated into vacuous concepts."
Yeah, that was exactly what I had in mind. This passage, yeah, and just to the discussion about like the no on the bridge and things. I found it interesting that he basically doesn't give like a blueprint how to become a rebel, right, or how to resist tyranny, because he knows that just doesn't work, right? So it's more like this inner transformation thing, and everything, like the examples he gives, they are like examples, to illustrate more or less. But the dynamics are interesting, because that he makes the point, for example, that you might even be handing the regime basically a list of dissidents, right? If you, let's say you vote no, or there are other contexts where, if you get organized or do some action or in some situations, you might actually be helping the regime. And so it's really not so clear cut. And I was reminded, I mean, that's maybe part of the reason why this book on Jünger in general has become popular again, so to speak. I mean, the whole COVID thing was just the perfect example of how this kind of stuff is still so relevant. And we all had these decisions to face, right? I mean, some people just stirred up the pot, so to say, right? Made a big scene, and maybe some got even in trouble, right, with the authorities because of their like refusing to wear masks and whatever, like making a point. And so, but sometimes that just got them into trouble with the authorities, right? And maybe a nice graffiti on a bridge would have been more effective. So we saw that here in France a lot. There were like really good graffitis at very prominent places. So the French, if you don't want to know something about protests, that's the country to be. And that's just I thought, as you said, Ilan, this book is just so relevant in a sense and so timeless. And I think part of the reason might also be that because of Jünger's fascinating life, and that he was never like part of some ideology or political movement, really, and he because a lot of like intellectual life, in Germany after the war and stuff, it kind of switched over to this kind of, okay, now we have the great democracy or whatever, and that's our ideology, and he always kept like out of everything in a sense, and was just a very good observer, and I think that's part of the reason why he was able to suss out these deeper dynamics.
Yeah. On the topic of observation, so he lived through the period of Nazi Germany, where the kind of high level of technocracy was brought to its ultimate kind of higher limit for the time, I think. There are books, IBM and the Holocaust, about how technology was being implemented in wholly new ways by the Nazi government to automate identification, to automate genocide, to automate slavery. And so he had to have been privy to some of this information, I think. Being in the military, being connected to people, having his ear to the ground. And also Nazi Germany was...
He was censoring letters in Paris. That was part of his job. He was a censor, so he sure got to know a lot of stuff.
So he was effectively, the guy from 1984, sitting there at his desk, with the magic marker and putting back the news bit in the vacuum tube, sanitized. The
guy in the main character in The Lives of Others at the end, when he gets put in the letter department, unsealing people's letters and just boring, reading people's correspondence for subversion.
Yeah. And these were all just, lower tech versions of all of these misinformation websites that are being run by NGOs and intelligence agencies that we're seeing today. This is the kind of precursor, the original version in more contemporary times of all of these forms of censorship and propagandizing that we're reading stories about now. So I think having lived through that period and that place, he was in a very good position to understand what it meant and what it means for individuals to find that forest passage, that place that finds freedom from all of it and kind of shakes it off but not only reacts to it, but seeks to, he also has a passage about listening to other people who have done the research, who have some knowledge, embracing the wisdom of friends, of family, of lovers, anyone in your network, in your circle that's going to help lift you from, what is, or what sometimes seems like this incredible behemoth of a control system. So I really appreciate that about him as well.
In addition to like the no on the bridge, he gives one other example of a kind of resistance. Let me see where to start here. So this is again back in the section on elections. So then come the spoiled and empty ballots. So he's talking about the people who are counting the votes. And he's envisioning the environment. So, you've got these people in the back room of the voting station. Now they get to count the votes. They open up and they're going through and they're counting. And, maybe I'll go back a bit further. So I'll read the whole paragraph because it's good. The committee we meet here is also in uniform, though perhaps in shirt sleeves, and exudes a spirit of familiar sociability. It is composed of local representatives of the sole ruling power, plus propaganda experts and police. The atmosphere is that of a shopkeeper counting his take, but not without suspense, since all present in the room are more or less responsible for the results. The yeas and nays are read out, the first with sympathetic, the second with malignant satisfaction. Then come the spoiled and empty ballots. The atmosphere becomes most uncomfortable when the epigram of some joker pops up, certainly a rarity in these days. Humor, together with the rest of freedom's entourage, is absent in tyranny's sphere of influence. Yet the wit is all the more cutting when the joker puts his own head on the line. So I read that just for that last line about humor, and so it's a funny image of the vote counters, who are these completely humorless beings, only concerned about their their own motives. Good for the yays because they need to meet their vote quota for the higher ups, and they need a certain amount of nays, but there's still a little bit of tension because they need the right amount. Right? They can't have too many yays, can't have too few nays. And then all of a sudden they get the spoiled ballot where someone just writes this ripper of a joke. And in that situation, well, they're not going to laugh. But so again, it's one of those futile acts of resistance where you only get satisfaction out of it for yourself and maybe the imagined response of pissing off some guy in the back room that's actually counting the vote. But the principle is there, that last principle, yet the wit is all the more cutting when the joker puts his own head on the line. And that's the great thing about, and that's illustrated, for example, in V for Vendetta with just the cheesy vaudeville show and where they send up the chancellor, and it's just a silly little joke, but in the context, of course, I mean, it gets him, it gets the secret police to his door for putting on that production. And so humor is this essential thing. It's an essential way of bringing down the clowns that are at the top, that are in the positions of power. And the joke is all the more cutting when you're actually putting yourself on the line. And you can see that that should be what the stand-up comics, that's what a lot of stand-up comics today are saying, is that that's our job, is to point out these controversial topics and speak of them in such a way that that people can laugh and see the ridiculousness of it, but at the same time they're putting themselves on the line. They could not only be canceled or beat up or conceivably even worse, but humor is that essential thing.
When I read that part, when I read that line, what came to me was y'all's discussion on at the Tonic 7 on that channel, where maybe John Carter was talking about the essential nature of humor in robbing tyranny of its bite, of its teeth.
Yeah, and of its seriousness.
Yeah.
It's very serious.
It's all very serious. And so if you can disarm it, if you can disarm your fear with humor, And I think that was one kind of like essential like point wrapped in that one little line, that if you can rob not only the tyrant of his teeth, but also death of its sting, that you empower yourself just as much as you disempower those other things. And so, humor is essential and should not be underestimated. And I would love to, if there's some kind of way of, having something like that where you can, scribble on a little like an election ballot for like, you draw a little picture of like Joe Biden sniffing a kid or something on a ballot. Like that would be just hilarious, and, it would be really fun, I think, for whoever might be so inclined.
And any joke can work. It's like, imagine at your televised show trial, and you've just been sentenced to death, execution for treason, and they ask for your final words, and then you just let out like a little fart. It's like the lowest brow of humor just acquires this this level of the sublime resistance, just to show the how ridiculous the whole situation is. But back, I wanted to make a different point. This was something that that you'd brought up, I think, Luke, and this was about the. What did you say? Something about there will always be people who will just resist the conformity or something. I can't remember how you phrased it, but this reminded me of a couple threads or strands of stuff that I've been thinking about and reading lately. And one of them comes up in Lobachevsky's Logocracy, which I've been summarizing on my Substack. And it's this idea of the idea of a logocracy, as opposed to other systems of government, is to attempt to make a system of government that accepts the realities of human nature and that accounts for them and works with them, as opposed to trying to reshape them or to ignore them completely. And so part of this, I would say, I've said this in a different context before, is to take into account that there will always be people who will resist being told what to do or what to think simply on principle. And that, of course, you'll get some people like that who will just be psychopaths because they're totally antisocial to begin with. But there's this weird dichotomy that it's also the people who are the most developed and who are the most free thinking and the most, let's say, advanced, spiritually or mentally or whatever, or emotionally, that it rubs them the wrong way, even if they agree with it. So this was in the context of something you'd said about Jünger, how he didn't fit into any box. And so he
with
wasn't
the denazification thing, right?
Right. So he wasn't a fascist, but when it's like denazification, it's like, oh, and now you want to, tell me what to think and make sure I have the right thoughts. Well, no, screw you.
Exactly,
I'm not a Nazi, but I'm not gonna prove it to you. I'm not gonna, bend over for you.
And he wasn't even a party member, I think. So right. Yeah.
Right. So there's this kind of person. So it's very easy, and I think a lot of people get a lot of people who wouldn't ordinarily be totalitarians who will get caught up in this authoritarian type of thinking. It's like, well, if only we just forced everyone to agree, for the greater good. If we just, we need unity. So we have to kind of push people a little bit to get that, that full conformity. And as long as it's good, as long as the government actually fulfills its role and just requires that no one disagree with them, well, that's okay. Well, it's like, no, that even if you can imagine, and even if there would be positive outcomes from that, there's something fundamentally anti-human about it, because you are automatically cutting off you're automatically cutting out that segment of the population, which is the Jüngers of the world, who are probably some of the most, I wouldn't necessarily say intelligent, but the most important and talented. And and you're cutting them out of the process because you're forcing them to do something that, even if they would agree with your policies, that's fundamentally against their nature. So you're going to create a critic out of them. And if you create a critic out of them, you're not going to get their support, and they're not going to back you with 100% of their being. They're not going to be there to offer their support. You're pushing them into a corner. So any government that for whatever reason, antagonizes that segment of the population, they're doing something fundamentally wrong. And that is where this, and so these are the people that would basically follow the forest passage. They'd take a walk in the forest. That relates, so that was something else I wanted to point out from the summary. So this is a part of the book that I haven't read yet, but it's the point he makes about even the churches can only lend a hand here, since man stands alone in his choices. The theologian may be able to make his situation clear to him, but cannot deliver him from it. The forest rebel crosses the null meridian under his own power. So this is a very Dabrowskian view of the individual, and so Dabrowski will. I haven't read Dabrowski in a while, so all the terminology isn't at the forefront of my mind. But basically, there's the third factor. So the anti-conformist, socialization. There's basically thinking for yourself and making choices for oneself, being authentic to oneself. And it's also maladjustment. Yeah, that was the word. So you've got adjustment and maladjustment, but you've also got positive and negative versions of each. And so one of the points that Dabrowski makes about people at high levels, people at high developmental levels, is that they will reject any kind of externally imposed or extrinsically imposed moral value or something. It's like, and it is that rebelliousness. It's like, no, just because you're telling it to me, and just because I agree with you, I'm offended that you're trying to force it on me. I'm not going to accept it just because you tell me to. If I'm going to accept it, it's going to be my choice. I'm going to come to it authentically from my own. I'm going to freely choose to accept this ideal or not. And the fact that you are trying to force me to do it is a sign that you don't get that. And so that just makes me not trust you even further. Even if you're saying all the right things, I cannot trust you if you're trying to coerce me into agreeing with you. And so it's a very, I just found that to be a very Dabrowskian point. It's like we're leaving the crowd, leaving the herd, the herd mentality to come to fully make one's choices and to establish one's character and one's convictions on one's own without the coercion of even a well-intentioned nanny state. It's like, no, there are no nanny states for the individual in this perspective.
Yeah, and what seems to rile as you put it, the Jüngers of the world up, especially, or even it's the main point is not so much obedience or the demand of an authority to obey, right? I mean, Jünger was a soldier, right? I mean, it's like it's not necessarily that, but it's first and foremost the power. If the state uses the power to force you to think a certain way or to accept certain thoughts or to reiterate certain thoughts, like this being put to the question kind of thing, right? That's what people that are non-conformists or think for themselves, what just drives them nuts, right? I mean, you can obey even if you don't really agree with something. You can always obey authority out of utilitarian reasons, or because you understand that sometimes you just got to shut up and obey. It's part of life. But where it crosses the line is really when they try to control your thoughts, and we can see that playing out today as well, right? I mean, this whole mass awakening kind of thing, or contrarianism we're seeing today. It's not necessarily because people don't want to do this or do that, but it's because of this insufferable, nanny. You need to think a certain way, otherwise you're bad, kind of thing. And that's, I think that was a good point, actually.
There was, so to backtrack just a little bit, another interesting thing that I found about, the way he was describing, like totalitarian systems and the developments of it, he uses the word automism or automatism, and essentially referring to the functionaries of these kinds of things as automatons, which going back to what we discussed earlier about maybe his semi-familiarity with Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff uses similar language for people who haven't developed themselves at all. They are just mechanical reaction machines. They are automatons, and so I found that really an apt description for the types of people who are the functionaries of whatever totalitarian system, who put people to the question or hand out the ballots and then count the ballots. They aren't well-developed or highly developed beings in themselves. They are just, caught up in the moment of the time stream as it is at that, particular point where, they cannot see beyond or outside. They are just, basically robots and should be regarded as such in certain ways. So you want to...
Well, this passage speaks to that pretty directly, and that was what you spoke of. He writes, however, these same men are not just fearful, they are also fearsome. The sentiment changes from fear to open hate the moment they notice a weakening in those they feared only a moment before. It is not only in Europe that one comes across such congregations. Where the automatism increases to the point of approaching perfection, such as in America, the panic is even further intensified. There it finds its best feeding grounds, and it is propagated through networks that operate at the speed of light. The need to hear the news several times a day is already a sign of fear. The imagination grows and paralyzes itself in a rising vortex. The myriad antennae rising above our megacities resemble hairs standing on end. They provoke demonic contacts. And that's where what you were mentioning before, Adam, about this sense that there is something almost demonic that he evokes in his language, in the propagation of fear, of making people terrified of what is occurring. And this is something that we're, watching on a daily basis unfold in the U.S. Cable news is covering the mass shootings and the derailments and the various destructions that are occurring mainly in the U.S. or so it seems to me right now, and it is all in effect an effort to keep people scared shitless and glued to the authoritarian messaging that would seek to corral them into a certain way of thinking and feeling. And that can be in one of two ways. It can be either in causing someone to seek out authority even more in the hopes of feeling, safe and secure. The government's doing something about this. Or it can be among a certain percentage of the population a reaction, knowing full well that a lot of these events and developments are to some great degree manufactured and designed to keep us terrified and so that in itself can be something that people fall prey to in their reactions, in their anger and their hatred. And so I think Jünger is speaking of that as something to watch out for as well, that we don't, if we can see what's going on, we don't want to be reactive to it in a way that's going to necessarily get us in trouble.
And part of the fear, or how to battle the fear, is also, I think it might be later in the book, but he gives the example of that we are living under the illusion that the tyrant basically protects us, right? And it starts even with basic things like protection from like a robbery in your apartment or in your house. And he says that basically, like, it's kind of funny. It's like the basic defense line is the father and the son with an axe in their hand, you know, in the front door or something like that. So that's basically like that's the reality of it, right? And the state and the tyrant, they're building this like whole system around it where you're under the illusion that this is not the reality. The reality is that the police or whatever will always like protect you, right? And I found that interesting because it doesn't necessarily like argue for like wielding axes, you know, in your front door necessarily, but it's like it's a thought experiment where you that can help you get over your fear, right? If you accept that this is the basic reality, right? You and then axe, and if you kind of accept that image and maybe even draw some conclusions, right? Maybe you want to be in shape, and maybe, who knows, maybe you even want to have an axe somewhere in the house. But it's like it's just this cultivation of a fierce independence of mind and spirit and soul. I think that he's talking about, and that helps us get out of this fearful state, because if we think, oh my God, you know, if the state, we need the state to protect us in everything, and otherwise they're coming for us, you know, the January 6th protesters will get me, and you know, and whatever, it's the scare story of the day, and it's a way to distance yourself from this overwhelming, like, abusive relationship almost, you know, with the tyrant.
And he also, you know, there's a passage about being armed to the teeth, and being prepared in such a way so as to meet force with force, and how, you know, the danger in that is that you can actually attract those types of events to you, being so identified with responding in such a or being prepared to respond in such a violent and physical manner. And this gets back to the points that you guys made repeatedly earlier about Jünger being so difficult to pin down, because it's not only ideologically, it's sort of as though he's saying, you know, you do want to find the forest passage and rebel, but think about it in terms of limitations as well. And you do want to be prepared to do what you need to do, but think about how that may be so far in reaction to what you fear that's going to attract certain negative events to your life. So he's really quite nuanced about it. He's constantly bringing you to the edge of the circle, the end of the spectrum of reaction and response, and saying, well, this is where you may want to consider the fact that taking it too far or too little in either direction is not going to be constructive. And it's kind of like a balancing act he's trying to impart on us in the way that we think about how we want to respond and how we want to think about those things that we're facing. So very nuanced in many cases here, and I appreciate that a lot. It's you know, far too often, you know, especially in alternative media, we're getting advice and insights and suggestions that take things perhaps too far in some direction. And it just gets back to, what you mentioned earlier, Adam, this middle way, or the fourth way, this way of staying on the Titanic and not being sunk with the Titanic, not letting yourself, jump into the ocean of chaos, even though there's going to be a certain amount of chaos on the boat, should you decide to remain. So he's really, at all points looking for literally a middle way that we can find, a moderate way, but that is nonetheless decisive and forwarding in whatever situation we find ourselves in.
Well, Luke, do you have any final thoughts? Maybe we'll return to the book once we've all finished it, and we can cover more of the ideas in the second half. But did you have anything to kind of wrap up with?
No, except to recommend it. It's, as you guys said, it's a very short book, and from the quotes you read, I can tell that the translation seems to be pretty good as well. Because one thing is really like his German is just very beautiful. So it's a very poetic language, but still very clear. But also gives you this kind of this almost ambiguity at times that speaks to the nature of the thing, right? That it's not black and white, and that it's not really it's not just an essay about politics or like political philosophy. It's also poetry in a sense, right? So, but from what I can tell, the translation is very good. So yeah, get the book. It's really very very relevant to our times, and also from what I understand is that Jünger's thought gets, as I said in the beginning, gets a lot of traction, and just even as if to stay on top of that and to just have your ear, a little bit on the ground, what is brewing in the culture, in the alternative culture. And I think also from that perspective, it's interesting to read him because he has kind of a bit of a renaissance. And see you in the forest.